just thinking about beauty again, and I'm particularly thinking about how we talk about beauty, and how the kind of way that people talk about it, I guess professionally, you know what I mean, out there in the world, and the way we feel about it, it's often quite disconnected, isn't it, you know what I mean? Because there are lots of writings and theories of beauty. You know, there's a whole history of aesthetics and the use of beauty in art and anthropology and evolutionary psychology, various kind of cultural and media studies takes on what constitutes beauty, relationships between beauty and ethics. Lots and lots of stuff has been written, but it's all, I always find, I've read some of it, you know, but it's always, and it's fine, it's really interesting, and I enjoyed it and I get a lot from it, but it's always hard, I find, to connect that up to personal experience, you know. I guess because of just that classic problem that you have from, you know, relating the subjective to the objective. All those discourses, those ways of talking about beauty are ways of talking about it, you know, that's over there, you know, places it outside of your body and regards it as an object, so you have to treat it objectively, you know what I mean, and all the language is all about that distancing, objectivizing way of doing it. Necessarily so, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation. That's how it does it. Where of course your own experience of beauty is these things turning inside you, isn't it? That's the experience, that something is turning over inside you and affecting the way you feel in your most, you know, in your most intimate being, really. So it's there is going to be a disconnect. It's both called, you know, both experiences are experiences of beauty, but there is a kind of disconnect there, isn't there, you know? And it's the same disconnect that you find in things like consciousness studies and all of that kind of stuff, you know what I mean? How do you talk about something that's got both a first person and a third person aspect? I mean, the way I'm kind of thinking into that right now is I'm kind of imagining what middle ground might look like. You know, is there a middle ground, that a way of talking about something that's in the middle, that can lean one way towards the objective, or has a way of being translated into the objective, but also has a way of relating back to the subjective felt sense of, in this case, beauty. And here I'm thinking about something like folk science or naive science, it's sometimes called. I don't like the term naive because it sounds a bit pejorative. But folk science, if you're not familiar with it, fascinating area of study, I think. It should be folk sciences, really. There's a folk biology, a folk psychology, folk physics, folk chemistry, these things. And what they are is, these are kind of ways of looking at the world, knowledge about the world, that's said to exist prior to education. You know what I mean? Because we are kind of natural born scientists in a way, all of us, and that we, as humans, but as animals as well, I guess, we make hypotheses about the world. We guess where the world is constructed. You know, we find organisation or patterns in the world, and we recognise them and try to relate them to one another. We're constantly solving the problems of the world just by being alive and awake. It's one of the things we do, isn't it? You know. So in a sense, we're always making hypotheses about the world. Up until about 400 years ago, that was the dominant way of doing it. You made hypotheses about the world, and you wrote those hypotheses down, and you acted upon them, and you tried to relate them to one another. But about 400 years ago, with the kicking off of the scientific revolution, then you start getting testing processes, which confirm or deny whether these hypotheses are actually true or not. And it seems amazing, really, doesn't it? That up until 400 years ago, no one thought of saying to themselves, perhaps we better just check to make sure these feelings we have about the world are correct. But apparently not. But as I say, folk science, you know, all sort of science, even, I'm not even sure that would be the right word for it, but all that kind of knowledge constructing process prior to the scientific revolutions of 400 years ago was like folk science. You know, you felt the way the world was and put it into words, and that's still the way we come into the world. You know, all children are natural born folk scientists, if you like. We come into the world as kind of little scientists, but without the empirical method, without the capacity to test. We have to learn that later on. So we make speculations about the world, and some of them are right, some of them are wrong. And they're very stable. You know, many people, the vast majority of people, make the same kinds of folk scientific hypotheses, come up with the same theories about the world. Some of the classics, for example, if you've got two things, one in each hand, I've got a camera in that hand obviously, so I can't do this, but if I had two rocks in one hand right now, and one was heavy and one was light, it would feel like the heavy one was going to hit the ground first if I dropped them. You know what I mean? Drop two rocks, one's heavy, one's light. If I was to drop them, it would feel to me, intuitively, that the heavy one would hit the ground first. And if you ask any child that, if you just give a child two rocks and say which of these will hit the ground first, they will say the heavy one hits the ground first. In fact, if you can give many adults that, they will still do it. Even physics graduates have been tested with that, and some physics graduates still make that mistake. The heavy one feels heavy, it feels like it wants to get to the ground first, because folk physics has got this kind of intentionality in it. The heavy rock feels like it wants to get to the ground first, so we assume it's going to fall faster. And that was fully accepted universal scientific knowledge until Galileo, you know what I mean? So all the greats, the really smart people of history, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, you know, all the works right the way through, until Galileo thought that was absolutely true. You know, thought that if you drop these two objects, the heavy one would hit the ground first. And Galileo testing it found they don't. You know, but there's a folk assumption there, a folk physics assumption about the way objects behave, that is producing very stable results in what people think prior to testing. And that's an example of a folk science hypothesis. Now, of course, it's wrong. There's no doubt about it. It's wrong, but it's wrong in a consistent way, and it's perfectly possible to translate between folk physics in that particular case, between folk physics and real physics. You know, you can take the statistics of, you know, you can ask people about these rocks falling. You can get them to make estimates about the difference of the speed they'll fall at, and you can make a stable adjustment, and it'll kind of translate back into Newtonian physics. So even though folk physics is wrong, it's wrong in a way which is stable enough to allow it to be translated in most cases. So I'm thinking something like, is there a way, for example, of finding some kind of middle ground which allows you, in the case of does the same thing for beauty, I'm not saying that beauty is wrong, but there's a kind of middle term that can both appeal to our intuitions and our subjective experience of beauty in a way that the weight of these rocks appeals to our intuitive sense of how matter behaves in the world. Is there a way of doing that while also leaning outwards towards those kind of writings and theories and thoughts about beauty that have been produced in those disciplines I mentioned earlier, aesthetics and ethology and anthropology and so on, leans outward in that direction, you know. I mean, if it was, I'm not saying it is, but if there was a kind of folk science that existed, a folk science of beauty that existed somewhere in the middle between those objective sciences and disciplines and the subjective feeling of what beauty is, what kind of a folk science would be in that gap there, and what what material would it be under study? I think, because this is all of the body, this stuff. You know, beauty is a fully embodied sensation. You know, you can feel it in your body. So it would have to be a folk science that addresses the feelings of the body and the movements of those feelings of the body. So I think something like a chemistry, a language that's a bit like chemistry of the body, because all the language of beauty is about the language of chemistry. A lot of it is not real chemistry, but a kind of folk chemistry. You know, a lot of it is about those kind of things. So I think a kind of folk chemistry of the body, you know, perhaps to do with those humours, you know, that used to be around in medieval physiology, maybe something like that, or maybe some vitalist ideas of the body to do with essential forces or meridians or whatever, that kind of stuff. Not the real body. We're talking about the imaginary body that appeals to intuitions. So it would be that kind of thing, some kind of folk chemistry. And I think that the item under scrutiny by that thing would be what the self is, but not the real self, not the self that's described by objectivizing language like neuroscience or biology or psychology, but the self which is a kind of intuitive version of what a self is, which I think is much more like one of those Russian Matryoshka dolls, you know, the dolls that stack inside one another. You know, the bigger one, the smaller, because that's what a self feels like, I think. Again, there's no correlate in standard physics yet, but that's kind of how it feels like, and a lot of the language around what being a self is uses that image. You know, where parts of ourself are out there on shore to the world, parts of ourselves might actually be out there in the world, little photonic eyes going out there somehow. But parts of ourselves we feel are retreated inside ourselves, don't we? Like a smaller and smaller doll, closer and closer to the centre, with a core self being right inside. You know what I mean? When people talk about their inner self, they make these kind of gestures, don't they? As if their self is somehow in their chest here somewhere. It's a core inside themselves. Again, just to remind you, I'm not saying this is real in terms of physiology, but in terms of a kind of intuitive understanding from the self, which would be appealed to by something like folk chemistry. That, I think, would work as a model of the self. So I think to talk about beauty, just to sum up, one of the ways perhaps to talk about it would be by using this language that exists between the intuitive and the objective, between the subjective and the world. And it would be a language drawn from folk chemistry, and it would talk about the core self, a kind of alchemy of the heart, you might say. That makes sense? It's not real, of course. When I say alchemy of the heart, I'm talking poetically.